All right, everyone. Hi. Thank you so much for joining me for this week's podcast episode. I'm hearing the same thing in different ways right now with my clients and some stuff on LinkedIn. And I was marinating on this thought for the last couple of days and really trying to think of like the best advice or the best stance that can be effective for all marketers, for lack of better words. I feel like everything in marketing it's subject to something. It depends on the situation, it depends on the tech stack, it depends on the goals. So I was trying to really think and like outline some thoughts on what like my general advice would be for any and all marketers right now going through the situation. And essentially, in short, what I'm hearing is that it's a no-brainer that we should be doing more marketing tactics. It's a no-brainer that we're not doing the correct things that we're supposed to in order to give us that compounding effect. However, it's really hard to do that when budgets are being pulled back, expectations are being pulled back, teams and resources are being pulled back. So the question that I hear is, what's the right place to invest? Should we be sticking to our fundamentals right now? Or should we be testing out some new channels? Like with the limited budget that we have, the limited resources, what's the best place for us to either pay to play, organically play, like at a high level, what is it that we should be doing? So for today's podcast, I wanted to dive a little bit more into that with some general recommendations. And of course, if you have additional questions on how this could best be applied to you, like please reach out and we can continue the conversation. But in general, I think if you're trying to figure out how you should always be experimenting, which is what you'll hear in the industry, is that you should always be experimenting. I think part of it is you got to make sure that you're first sticking with the fundamentals. Like you aren't just trying to do everything at once. You aren't just trying to be everywhere. You aren't just trying to do it all. We really need to scale back and identify what is it that we're actually trying to do. And then from there, outline what the correct thing for short term, long term, and all those things work together in order to achieve the success that we're wanting to get to. At a minimum, you should be identifying what's actually working to drive pipeline and see what flexibility you have to kind of tug and pull to make room for some of the other experiments or tests that you want to be running. But what you don't want to do right now is not have that insight into what's actually impacting and driving pipeline, because then you'll pretty much like hurt your momentum. What we want to do is get something that's kind of steady stream and then find a different way to add in a test model that can then continue that momentum and catapult that growth. And before we talk about testing, what we should, where we should, at the bare minimum, you need to identify what that rhyme and reason is behind doing a test. Just hearing that you should always be experimenting in the industry isn't good enough for why you should be doing that today and why a CFO should trust you with marketing dollars to go do that. We've got to have a very clear understanding on what we're actually doing to get into these testing models and conversations. The next thing that I want to call out before we kind of get into the how-tos is that buy-in has to be there before we even get to the conversation of what we're going to do about it. And getting that buy-in sometimes can be challenging, and knowing how to navigate those conversations can also be challenging. Again, it depends on the persona that you're talking to. It depends on what was done before, if there's any like PTSD that you need to overcome. But in general, what has worked for me when it comes to, and I work mostly with companies who are not normally actively hitting their revenue targets and they're seeking a change. And so when that happens, I like to call them out on that and say, listen, like we just did this exercise where you and I are agreed on where we want to go. And you'll probably hear me talk about this in multiple other content pieces of mine. I call it a gap analysis. We go through that gap analysis of what they're telling me of where they want to go and identifying where they currently are. And most of the time, these are really hard conversations, but these hard conversations have to be had. We have to understand and all be in the same page of what's realistic, what's feasible, and what's actually worth the investment. If we're not aligned on that, then like nothing else really matters. Like we need to start at that starting point. And so what I like to do after we go through that gap analysis, and I say, listen, what we're doing today, it ain't going to get us there. It ain't going to get us to the point where you and I just talked about getting. Like it ain't, right? So what we need to do is figure out a way to get us there. And normally the twofold of that is saying we need to have a combination of tactics between setting the foundation and constantly learning and revising. So with that, what I like to do is then build out that strategy from that gap analysis of what we learned all the way from the top down, the tippities of like what we need to change holistically, strategically, from an infrastructure perspective, all those little nuances, all the way down to the channel investments, the channel strategies, everything like the minute details. We got to start from the tippity top. And then we map out how we're going to get there. From there, it's pretty clear, at least for me and hopefully for most marketers, what should be considered a short-term initiative and what should be considered a long-term investment. And again, this goes down to having that understanding of what is currently working and what is currently influencing and hitting pipeline. So those things are almost essentially untouchable, assuming that they're successful and they're the right tactics and, positive ROI and all those things. So from there, what we do is I slice and dice that short-term versus long-term. And I kind of come with like a peace offering, if you will, because if somebody feels some type of way about trying a new experiment or trying a new test, most of the time there's going to be a little more conversations for gaining the true buy-in. And so I like to come with a peace offering of identifying what those short-term tactics are that we are headstrong going to be focused on. Like those we are not in question, and essentially like make it known that we're not just going to go and turn towards these experiments and like totally lose sight of the direction or the strategy of what we're trying to build. Like it's a mixture of both. Like we're going to be heavily invested in meeting these short-term goals and laying the foundation while we still build the component for the longer term strategy. And it also has the expectation has to be set from the jump, like why we're actually doing this experiment. And so we really got to really outline how it will or won't impact either the month, the quarter, the first half, second half of the year, whatever metrics you go by. It needs to have that expectation up front of like, listen, we're going to be doing these short-term tactics, but we're also going to be investing in these long-term initiatives. And with that, we don't expect that to compound until at least, 3 to 6 months, right? From then, at that point, we can then measure if we're on the right track or not. So that expectation needs to be set like upfront. Another recommendation that I have for mixing in some of the testing methodologies is to make sure that you're not putting all of your eggs in one basket. And for example, what I mean by that is if you have not had success on LinkedIn, for example, and you know that you're supposed to, but you haven't actually dedicated the time, or maybe you don't have the right audience, or whatever the reasoning is behind why you haven't seen success within LinkedIn, don't say that we're going to test LinkedIn again. Don't say that we're only going to spend the money to do a test within LinkedIn. We should offer a testing mechanism for like 2 to 3 channels, like budget willing, resources willing, in a perfect world, right? Offer about 2 to 3 channels, LinkedIn included, and then see which one performs the best out of those experiments. It's really hard to say that, and the reason I say that is because it's really hard to say we've never seen success on LinkedIn again, but we're going to go test it and hope that this new direction works. Versus if I came in and I said, listen, we're going to test these 3 channels and we're going to test a change in messaging. We're going to change a test of content, a change in audience, a more strategic approach to our ICPs. And based on that experiment within these 3 channels, we're going to find what works. Which one would you want to buy in more? You have to come with that solution of, listen, like we're determined to do a test that's going to give us the next level of growth, and just saying we were never successful before, now we're going to try it again. That's really hard, especially if there is PTSD behind that, to come in and say, trust me with this experiment. So again, depending on who you're talking to, depending on what that previous engagement and previous history is, you have to navigate that conversation accordingly. But at the end of the day, what I like to say is we're looking for compound growth. We're looking for repeatable, scalable playbooks. And at the end of the day, what we're doing right now, it's not going to get us to the level of growth projection that we're looking for unless we start investing in X, Y, and Z. And if you don't know the answer to what those are first, like that's when you need to seek help. We need to figure out either a third party, a marketing leader, but there should be a clear plan of what's next, what the next step is for marketing. Marketing should never just be turn it on and then everybody's jobs are done. There's always optimizing, rinsing, repeating, new audience, pivots, anything under the sun gets thrown to marketing. And it should never just be like a one and done or set it and forget it. There should always be a step of what's next. And so being very clear on the expectation of this is the strategy of what we're building today. This is what's going to help us impact pipeline for this quarter and next quarter while we integrate these longer term tactics. And we're going to do experiments on these 3 channels. And our expectation is X, Y, and Z. And at the end of Q3, for example, we're going to circle back on which one was deemed successful and then allocate the resources that to scale it. So I feel like if you're torn between what channels are the right channels, what has really helped me transparently, and you guys probably learned this if you listen to the episode that I did with Ryan Gibson on customer and market research, is identifying where your audience actually is. There are so many channels and resources and content hubs and partners and anything under the sun that a marketing person could invest in, both either organically or pay to play. And I would find it very hard to believe, especially for, mid startup to mid-level corporations, that they have it all figured out, that they have all the budget in the world and they're at every single channel possible that their audience consumes content. Most of the time, you have to sacrifice priorities, research, resources, and tactics in order to really get the movement going, and then eventually think about either where you're going to pivot, what you're going to incorporate next. And so having that conversation of that what's next component helps make that conversation for asking for an experiment or asking for a test budget a lot easier. And one of the things that I also pull back at the end of the day, which I said this already for today's episode, but I'll reiterate as just kind of like a closing thought, is what we're doing today isn't going to get us there. Like, if you and I are aligned on the goals of what we're trying to achieve, at some point we need to consider a change. And it's okay that maybe this quarter is not the right quarter for change, but you can also say, okay, how can we make that happen for Q3? Those are the hard conversations that not everybody is willing to have. I know, especially if you're an individual who doesn't like confrontation, or you don't even really like talking to a whole lot of people, like maybe you're more of an introvert, like you just kind of like to keep to yourself, asking you to step up and do these things, they can be really challenging and intimidating. But if you're pressed in a situation where you want to get a little bit more out of it, I really think that stepping up and having those hard conversations are essential to getting to that next step. And the last closing thought that I'll have here is, just because you test 1 channel or 3 channels doesn't always mean that it's going to be entirely successful. Like, it's okay to come back and be like, shucks, we failed, right? Like, it did not go in the direction that we wanted. And part of that is it's healthy for marketers to test the boundaries, to test the market, to test the tactics, to test the budget, all of those things, to understand what works for the audience. And even if you did market research, even if you have your boxes checked on where your audience consumes content and who they trust in the industry, and you did a pay to play there and it didn't work, the critical component here is to say that we accept defeat, which is also hard, of acknowledging that it didn't work, but it's also determining why and having that either as a conclusion to why we're never going to do it again, or a conclusion to maybe we need to try it a different way. So I hope that helps for today's conversation. Again, if you guys need to break down into anything for details, I know marketing is so like abstract and all of this is going to like really depend on your current situation. But I'm hearing this often where it's like, how can we justify brand awareness, for example, or how can we justify demand creation, or how can we justify having the entire go-to-market team be active on LinkedIn? Like, how do we justify making those type of organizational changes? And part of that has to go with making sure you're talking to the right person, and then outline that gap analysis and saying, listen, what we're doing today ain't gonna cut it. So we all need to figure out how to make the next step happen, or else we're just gonna sit here trucking on like we're doing and continually being unhappy with the results. So when you guys are ready to have that conversation, let me know. That's what I say. And I'll be here planning out the rest of the demand gen strategy in the meantime. So whenever you guys are ready to have that conversation, you know where to find me. That's what I tell people. Is sometimes it's not the right time to have those conversations. Sometimes when you have a lot of turnover, sometimes like a leadership shifts or changes or is going on a 3-month sabbatical. Like, you never know, right? So it all depends on the different scenarios. But I think what is mission critical at this point is to make sure that marketing is not just set it and forget it. Like, you've got to have a plan of what's next for growth, for learnings, for anything in order to continue justifying that marketing truly contributes to the bottom line of the business. Otherwise, we kind of circle back to the same conversations of what we're having of like, what good is marketing? So always thinking about what's next, having those hard conversations, not being afraid to fail and admitting failure, but then also coming with a plan to remedy those things and the next steps for success. So hope that helps. Thanks.